My name is Ren Castellano, and I'm 31 years old. 13 years ago, on the Tuesday before my 18th birthday, my father sat across from me at the dinner table and told me the party was off because my brother had just been dropped from his college baseball team and, "This family doesn't celebrate while your brother is grieving." I packed one suitcase that night, and I put one other thing in my coat pocket without even thinking about it. A small brass compass my grandmother had given me years earlier, the kind with a real needle that swings until it finds true north, whether you want it to or not. I didn't understand yet how much that object was going to end up meaning. I just knew I needed something in my hand that pointed at something real. I packed because I finally understood a math problem I'd been failing to solve since I was 9 years old, and I wasn't going to fail it one more time. Here's the part nobody in my family has ever said out loud, not once in 13 years. The scholarship interview that changed the entire trajectory of my life was scheduled for the exact same weekend as the birthday party they canceled. And my mother knew that. She'd known it for 6 weeks. She let me believe, for 6 weeks, that my 18th birthday and the biggest opportunity of my life were happening on the same joyful weekend, when in fact, she had already quietly arranged for one of them to disappear. I found that out 4 years later, standing in a courthouse hallway, holding a folder my grandmother had kept without telling anyone. And by the time I understood what I was actually looking at, it was too late to undo the years that folder had cost me. But it was not too late to make sure it never happened to anyone else in my family again. What I did with that folder set something in motion I couldn't have predicted, something that didn't fully detonate for another 18 months in a converted barn in front of 40 wedding guests when my own brother stood up mid-toast, pulled a small brass compass out of his jacket pocket, and said the 4 sentences that made our mother's wine glass slip out of her hand and shatter on the floor. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories, where the people who were told to make themselves smaller finally take up the whole room. If you've ever discovered, years later, that a moment you thought was just bad luck was actually a decision someone made on your behalf, stay with me, because this story has a document at the center of it, and I promise you'll want to see what's in it. To explain the party, I have to explain the ledger, because that's genuinely what it was, even before I had the vocabulary for it. My family ran on a very specific accounting system, and my brother Desmond was always the account that needed the most deposits. I was born 4 years before Desmond, and for those 4 years, from what my grandmother told me later, I was simply a child, uncomplicated, unremarkable, loved in the ordinary, unexamined way children are loved before anyone starts keeping score. Then Desmond arrived, 6 weeks premature, and something in my mother reorganized itself permanently around the memory of nearly losing him. I don't say that to dismiss what she went through. A premature birth is genuinely terrifying, and I've since read enough to understand that the fear doesn't always leave a person once the danger has passed. But I say it because it explains, without excusing, the next 18 years of my life. Desmond became the emergency that never fully ended. Every stumble he had, a bad grade, a fight with a friend, a disappointing tryout, got treated with the same intensity as that first terrifying month in the NICU. My stumbles got treated like scheduling inconveniences. When I broke my wrist at 10, falling off my bike, my mother took me to urgent care and was back home in 90 minutes, faintly irritated at the interruption. When Desmond, at 8, scraped his knee falling off the exact same bike, she called our pediatrician's after-hours line and sat with him on the bathroom floor for 45 minutes, checking every few minutes whether he felt dizzy. I want to be fair to my brother here, the way I've had to learn to be fair to him over the years. Because this story is not really about Desmond being a villain. He didn't ask to be born premature. He didn't ask to become the family's permanent emergency. He was cast in that role before he could form memories, the same way I was cast in mine. The capable one, the one who didn't need watching, the one whose accomplishments got filed away instead of celebrated, because celebrating me apparently risked making Desmond feel like less. The clearest early memory I have of the pattern is from when I was 11 and won the regional spelling bee, the actual regional competition, not just my school's. My mother came to watch, which felt like a miracle at the time. 20 minutes before they announced the winner, Desmond, 7 years old, tripped during a t-ball game across town and called our mother crying because his elbow hurt. She left before they called my name. I rode home from the auditorium with my grandmother, holding a trophy that felt, even then, like evidence in a case nobody else in my family was interested in prosecuting. Eleanor didn't say much about it that drive home, not directly. What she did instead, a few weeks later, was hand me a small brass compass at her kitchen table, unwrapped, no ceremony, the kind of object that had clearly belonged to someone before it belonged to me. "This was your grandfather's, from when he used to hike," she said. "A compass doesn't care what anybody else in the room is doing. It just tells you true north, whether or not anybody's watching, whether or not it's convenient. I want you to have something in your life that works like that." I didn't fully understand what she meant at 11. I understood it completely years later, standing in that same kitchen with a suitcase, and every year in between. By the time I was 14, I had learned to stop mentioning my accomplishments at dinner, because mentioning them started a very specific and predictable sequence. First, a beat of silence. Then my mother would say something like, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in a voice pitched exactly one register too flat to sound genuine. Then, within roughly 90 seconds, the conversation would pivot to something happening with Desmond, usually something that required immediate parental attention, and, more often than not, immediate parental money. That's the part that becomes relevant later, so I want to be specific about it now. My parents were not wealthy. My father managed a regional distribution warehouse. My mother worked part-time at a dental office. And money in our house was a real, constant pressure, not an abstraction. Every dollar had a destination before it arrived, and by the time I was in high school, an enormous percentage of those dollars were destined for Desmond. Travel baseball fees, private hitting coaches, a specialized summer camp in another state that cost more than my parents' car payment. When I asked once, at 15, whether there was a version of that kind of investment available for me, my father told me, not unkindly, that I didn't need it the way Des does. You're just naturally good at things. I have thought about that sentence more times in my adult life than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. What I actually was naturally good at, it turned out, was chemistry. Specifically, the kind of hands-on laboratory chemistry that most 16-year-olds find deadly boring, and I found, for reasons I still can't fully explain, thrilling. I started volunteering after school at a small research lab attached to the state university, 40 minutes from our house, run by a soft-spoken, exacting woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who did not go out of her way to make anyone feel comfortable, and, as a direct result, was the first adult in my life who felt entirely trustworthy. She didn't compliment easily. When she did, you could take it to the bank. By my junior year, Dr. Anand had quietly nominated me for something called the Kestrel Fellowship, a highly selective national program that funded a full 4 years of university tuition, room, and board for a small handful of students each year, contingent on an in-person interview weekend held every September, always the exact same weekend, the weekend closest to the autumn equinox, a detail that will matter enormously in about 10 minutes. I found out I'd made it to the interview round in July, the summer before my senior year, 3 weeks before my 18th birthday, which fell, that particular year, on the same Saturday as the Kestrel interview weekend. This was, on its face, an enormous problem, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my mother, genuinely worried, showing her the interview letter, and asking whether we could push the birthday celebration to a different weekend, since obviously the fellowship mattered infinitely more than a party. My mother's response is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it becomes the center of everything that happened later. She looked at the letter, looked at me, and said warmly, reassuringly, "Don't be silly. We'll figure it out. There's plenty of time before September. We're not going to make you choose between your birthday and your future." She said it with such total conviction that I believed her completely, the way you believe your mother when you are 17 years old, and she is looking directly into your eyes. What I did not know, what I would not learn for another 4 years, was that my mother had, within days of that conversation, quietly begun a separate set of arrangements that had nothing to do with reconciling the two events, and everything to do with making sure only one of them actually happened. The 6 weeks between July and my birthday in September were, on the surface, ordinary. Desmond, meanwhile, a junior at a mid-tier state university on a partial baseball scholarship, was having what my parents described as a tough season, not making consistent starts, frustrated, calling home more than usual. I didn't think much of it. Desmond's baseball career had been a rolling crisis for as long as I could remember. A rough patch was simply weather in our house, the atmospheric condition we all operated under. Then, on the Tuesday before my birthday, 3 days before both the party and the Kestrel interview, my father sat me down at the kitchen table with an expression I'd only ever seen him wear when delivering genuinely bad news. A car accident involving someone we knew, a relative's diagnosis. My stomach dropped before he even opened his mouth. "Des got cut from the team," he said. "Cut. Not benched. Cut. He's on his way home right now, and honestly, Ren, I don't think this is the weekend for a big party. It wouldn't feel right, celebrating while your brother is going through the worst thing that's ever happened to him." I want to walk through my exact reaction in that moment, because I think it matters for what comes later. I did not, in that first moment, think about myself at all. I thought about Desmond, genuinely, with real concern, because whatever the family dynamics were, he was still my brother, and I loved him in the specific, complicated way you love someone you've watched get simultaneously overindulged and quietly used as an excuse your entire childhood. My second thought, almost immediately after, was about the interview weekend, and I asked my father directly, did this mean the party was moving, or was it simply canceling outright? Because either way, I needed to still make it to the Kestrel interview on Saturday morning, 2 hours away. My father's face did something complicated when I asked that. A flicker of something I couldn't read at the time and have spent years since trying to interpret correctly. "Your mother's handling the logistics on that," he said, which was, in retrospect, the first crack in the entire structure. Because my father never once in my childhood described anything as logistics unless he was actively avoiding telling me something. I went to find my mother in the kitchen. She was on the phone, and I heard the tail end of her sentence before she noticed me in the doorway. Something about the Saturday slot, said in the particular clipped, efficient tone she used for appointments. She hung up quickly when she saw me, and turned around with an expression of such immediate, practiced sympathy that I now recognize, with the clarity of 13 years of hindsight, as the exact face of someone who has just finished doing something they know they'll need to explain later. "Sweetheart," she said, "I know the timing is just awful, but we can't do the party this weekend, not with everything going on with your brother. It wouldn't be fair to him." "What about Saturday morning?" I asked. "The interview's still happening either way, right? Dad's driving me?" There was a pause. A very small pause, less than 2 seconds, but I remember it precisely because it was the first moment in my entire life I saw my mother genuinely caught off guard by a question. "We'll figure that out," she said, which was, word for word, the exact phrase she'd used 6 weeks earlier about the birthday itself, and some old, tired part of me should have recognized the pattern immediately. I didn't. I was 17, and I trusted her. And trust, I've since learned, is a remarkably efficient blindfold. What actually happened over the following 3 days is something I only pieced together fully 4 years later, but I'll tell it to you now in the order I eventually understood it, because the order matters. My mother had, in fact, known about Desmond's likely dismissal from the baseball team for nearly 3 weeks before it happened. His coach had called her directly, coach to concerned parent, to give her advance warning that Desmond's roster spot was in serious jeopardy due to a combination of poor performance and, it later came out, a violation of team conduct rules involving a party that got out of hand. My mother had therefore known, weeks in advance, that there was a strong chance Desmond would be coming home in a state of crisis right around my birthday weekend. The exact same weekend as my interview. Instead of telling me any of this, instead of giving me the option to adjust, to ask Dr. Anand about alternate arrangements, to simply know what was actually coming, my mother made a decision entirely on her own. She quietly called the Kestrel Fellowship's regional coordinator's office and, representing herself as handling logistics on my behalf, asked whether there was any flexibility around my interview slot, given a family emergency. The coordinator, trying to be accommodating, offered an alternate slot the following week in a different city, 4 hours away, which would have required an overnight trip and, crucially, a parent's signed consent for travel, since I was still 17. My mother declined the alternate slot. She never told me it had been offered. She told the coordinator, on my behalf, that our family would simply withdraw from consideration that cycle, citing unforeseen circumstances, and asked that my file be considered for the following year's cohort instead, a request the coordinator's office noted, apologetically, could not be guaranteed, since Kestrel Fellows were typically only nominated once per student, and renomination the following year was rare and required a fresh recommendation. I did not find any of this out until 4 years later. What I actually experienced, in real time, at 17, was this. On the Tuesday before my birthday, my father told me the party was canceled because of Desmond's crisis. On Thursday, 2 days before the interview, my mother told me, with what looked like genuine regret on her face, that she was so sorry, but with everything going on with Desmond, she and my father simply couldn't manage the 4-hour round trip to get me to the interview that weekend, and that she'd already spoken to the fellowship people, and there would be another chance next year. I believed her. I had no reason not to. I was devastated, quietly, in the particular controlled way I'd learned to be devastated in that house, and I told myself that next year would come, that Dr. Anand would understand, that this was simply one more instance of the family emergency math I'd been living inside my entire life, unfair but survivable, the way it had always been survivable before. I found out 4 years later that there was no next year. Kestrel Fellows are, in fact, almost never renominated, and Dr. Anand, devastated on my behalf when I finally told her the truth as a college senior, confirmed that she had, in fact, followed up with the program the following spring on my behalf, unprompted, only to be told that the family had already formally withdrawn my name from consideration the previous September, and that no further action had been requested. She had never told me that either, assuming, reasonably, that my family had already explained it to me and that I'd simply decided not to reapply. Nobody had explained anything to me. I had spent an entire additional year of high school believing an opportunity was still coming back around, quietly grieving in private when it never did, never understanding that the door had already been closed, in writing, by my own mother, before I even finished packing for the party that got canceled instead. But I'm getting ahead of the actual story, because the night the party was canceled is where everything genuinely changed, and I need to walk you through it in the order it actually happened, because the order is the whole point. The Tuesday my father told me the party was off, I did something I had never done before in 17 years of living in that house. I asked, directly, calmly, without raising my voice, what exactly the plan was for Saturday, since the interview was still happening, whether or not there was a cake involved. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked at her phone. And in that silence, that specific 2-second silence that I now understand was the sound of a decision I hadn't been told about yet, something in me simply, finally, stopped waiting for an answer that clearly wasn't coming. I went upstairs. I did not slam any doors. I want to be honest that this was not a dramatic, movie-style exit. I packed one suitcase, methodically, the same way I approached everything in Dr. Anand's lab, because methodical was the only emotional register I had left after 17 years of learning that big feelings in that house got redirected toward Desmond within 90 seconds, regardless of their origin. The last thing I did before I zipped the bag was open my desk drawer and take out Eleanor's compass, still in the same worn leather pouch it had lived in since she gave it to me, and put it in my coat pocket, not because I had a plan for it, just because some instinct told me I was about to need to know which way was actually true. I had, it turned out, somewhere to go, and this is the detail that made everything that followed possible, the detail I've never fully explained publicly until now. My grandmother, my father's mother, Eleanor, lived 11 minutes away, in the same small yellow house she'd lived in my entire life. And Eleanor had, quietly, over the years, become the one relative who consistently, unfailingly showed up for me specifically. She'd come to the spelling bee my mother left early. She'd sat through every school science fair Desmond's crises had caused my parents to miss. She'd never once, in my entire childhood, made me feel like an inconvenience. I called her from my bedroom, suitcase already packed, and said simply, "Grandma, can I stay with you this weekend? I have somewhere I need to be Saturday morning, and I don't think Mom and Dad can take me." I did not tell her the full context that night. I didn't need to. Eleanor had watched this exact pattern play out for 17 years from the outside, and she asked exactly one question. "Does this have anything to do with your interview?" before telling me to come over immediately. That's the part of this story I think matters most, the part I want anyone listening to really sit with. Eleanor did not know that Tuesday night about the withdrawn fellowship application, about the phone call my mother had already made to the coordinator's office days earlier. Nobody knew that yet, including me. What Eleanor knew was simpler and, in its own way, more important. That a 17-year-old girl needed to be somewhere important on Saturday morning, and that her own son and daughter-in-law, for reasons she'd spent years quietly disapproving of, apparently weren't going to make that happen. She drove me to the interview herself that Saturday, in her decade-old sedan, 2 hours each way, and sat in the parking lot the entire time doing a crossword puzzle, rather than driving home and back, Because, as she told me afterward, she wanted to be the first face I saw walking out, whatever the outcome was. The interview, as far as I knew that day, went well. I sat in the waiting room beforehand with Eleanor's compass in my coat pocket, running my thumb over the worn brass casing, the way you'd worry a coin. And when the panel asked me, near the end, what drew me to chemistry in the first place, I found myself telling them about a woman who'd handed me an old compass at her kitchen table and told me it didn't care who else was in the room. One of the panelists actually smiled at that, the first real smile of the whole interview. I wouldn't find out for another 4 years that it had been entirely pointless, because my file had already been quietly withdrawn from consideration days before I ever walked into that room. A fact the interview panel themselves apparently didn't even know, since my mother's call had gone through the general coordinator's office, rather than directly to the interview committee. I sat in that room, answering questions about titration methodology and research ethics, genuinely believing I had a future riding on my performance, while a decision that had already made that future impossible sat quietly in an administrative file somewhere, unknown to everyone in that room, except, eventually, me. I did not go home that weekend. I stayed with Eleanor through my actual 18th birthday, which she marked with a small cake from the grocery store bakery and a card that said simply, "Proud of you, always, no conditions attached." I remember that phrase specifically, "no conditions attached," because I don't think I had ever, until that exact moment, encountered affection that didn't come with some invisible fine print. My parents called twice that weekend. I didn't answer either time. My mother texted eventually a message I still have saved. "We hope you had a nice birthday with Grandma. Things have calmed down here. Come home whenever you're ready. We love you." No mention of the interview. No question about how it went. I remember reading that text standing in Eleanor's small kitchen and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that my interview weekend had not registered in my mother's accounting system as an event worth asking about at all. I did go home, eventually, 3 days later, because I was 17. I turned 18 that weekend, technically, but I had nowhere else to actually live yet. No job, no apartment, nothing but Eleanor's spare room and a coffee tin of babysitting money I'd been saving since I was 14. I went home, and life resumed its familiar shape. Desmond, having been cut from his team, spent the following months in a prolonged, dramatic recovery process that consumed the household's entire emotional and financial attention. A transfer to a different school, a new set of private coaches, a summer training program that cost, I later learned, almost exactly what a year of Kestrel-funded tuition would have covered. One night that same fall, not long after I'd moved back in, I found Desmond sitting alone on the back porch steps, uncharacteristically quiet, staring at nothing. I didn't ask what was wrong. We weren't close enough yet at that point for me to ask and expect a real answer. But I sat down next to him anyway, and after a while, without really thinking about it, I took Eleanor's compass out of my pocket and handed it to him. The way you'd hand someone something to hold, just so their hands have somewhere to be. "Grandma gave me this," I said. "She said it doesn't care what anybody else in the room is doing." He turned it over a few times, watched the needle settle, and handed it back without a word. I didn't think much of the moment at the time. I didn't know, sitting on those steps, that he'd remember it for 13 years, or that I'd eventually mail him a replica of it, the same model, ordered from the same kind of Army surplus catalog Eleanor had originally found hers in, the week before his wedding, with a note that just said, "For whichever direction you decide to point yourself in. Love, W." I finished senior year quietly. I applied to a handful of ordinary state schools, got into the one with the best financial aid package, and left for college the following fall, with Eleanor's help covering the gap our family's aid package didn't. I did not think about the Kestrel Fellowship much during that time. The mind is remarkably good at filing away disappointments it doesn't yet understand the full shape of, and I genuinely believed, for years, that I had simply missed a one-time opportunity through ordinary bad luck, the kind of thing that happens to everyone eventually. The folder, the one I mentioned at the very beginning of this story, came into my life 4 years later, entirely by accident, in a courthouse hallway, of all places, during the process of settling Eleanor's estate after she passed away unexpectedly the winter of my senior year of college. Eleanor, it turned out, had kept meticulous records of nearly everything, a habit I inherited from her, without ever fully understanding where it came from until that moment. Among her papers, in a plain manila folder labeled simply W, September, was a printed copy of an email exchange she had, apparently, requested from the Kestrel Fellowship's regional office 3 years earlier, quietly, without telling me, after some instinct made her suspicious enough to ask. The email chain, dated the September after my interview, was between Eleanor and a program administrator, and it laid out in flat administrative language exactly what had happened. My application had been formally withdrawn by a parent contact on my behalf 4 days before my scheduled interview weekend, citing unforeseen family circumstances. The administrator's email to Eleanor, apologetic but factual, confirmed that fellows were not typically eligible for renomination, and that, unfortunately, my file showed no further activity after that withdrawal.
I sat in that courthouse hallway, holding 4-year-old proof that my mother had known, days in advance, that she was going to end my chances at that fellowship, and had chosen instead to let me believe I had simply failed to be renominated through no one's fault, while simultaneously never mentioning that she'd already made the withdrawal call before I even sat down for an interview she now knew to be entirely symbolic. I want to describe what I felt reading that email, because I think it's different from what people expect. I did not feel rage. Not in that first moment. I felt an almost clinical, cold recalibration, the way you feel when a diagnosis finally explains years of confusing symptoms. Every strange gap in that autumn, my mother's vague deflections, her refusal to ever directly discuss the interview afterward, the way the subject simply vanished from our household conversation entirely, suddenly resolved into a single, coherent, deliberate shape. I did not confront my mother immediately. I want to be honest about that, too, because I think the version of this story where I storm into her kitchen with the folder that same week would be more satisfying to tell and less true to what actually happened. I sat with it for 8 months, and I think those 8 months matter enough to describe properly, because they were not passive months. They were the months where I actually became the person capable of having that conversation at all. The first thing I did, 3 days after that courthouse hallway, was call Dr. Anand. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 years by that point, guiltily, the way you avoid a person who represents a door you believe closed through nobody's particular fault. I told her everything. The withdrawal, the email chain, the 4 years I'd spent believing I'd simply aged out of a one-time opportunity. There was a long silence on her end of the phone, long enough that I asked if she was still there. I called that office myself the following spring, she finally said, her voice tight in a way I'd genuinely never heard from her before. Not once, in all the years she'd corrected my titration technique without a flicker of sentiment. I was told the family had already withdrawn you and hadn't requested reconsideration. I assumed you knew. I assumed, Ren, that this had been a decision you were part of. She apologized, repeatedly, for not simply calling me directly at the time, rather than trusting the administrative channel. And I told her, honestly, that there was nothing she could have done differently with the information she'd had. The failure wasn't in her assumption. It was in the 6 weeks of silence that had produced it. That phone call did something I hadn't expected. It gave me somewhere to put the anger that didn't involve my mother at all, at least not yet. A place to grieve the actual, specific loss of the fellowship itself, separate from the betrayal of how it had been taken from me. Dr. Anand, it turned out, still had contacts at 2 smaller regional programs with rolling admissions, and over the following months, without any fanfare, she helped me put together an application to one of them. A partial research fellowship at a state university, 2 hours from where I'd ended up for undergrad. It wasn't Kestrel. It didn't erase 4 years of a different, harder path. But it was real, and it was mine, and nobody could quietly withdraw it on my behalf, because this time I filled out every form myself, checked every deadline myself, and gave the university my own phone number as the only point of contact. I finished my degree, chemical engineering, not the cut flower farm someone else built their story around, but my own version of the same defiant continuation, choosing the exact field my mother's decision had tried to quietly close off. I want to be honest that those 4 years of undergrad were not some triumphant redemption arc happening in real time. I worked 2 part-time jobs on top of the partial fellowship Dr. Anand had helped me find, slept far less than was probably good for me, and spent more evenings than I'd like to admit, doing the specific, quiet arithmetic of a person calculating whether they could afford both textbooks and groceries in the same month. Eleanor helped where she could, until she couldn't anymore, and after she passed, that particular safety net disappeared along with her.
I got my first job offer during my final semester, from a material science lab in another state. A genuinely good offer, better than I'd expected given everything, and I accepted it before I ever said a single word to my mother about what I'd found in that manila folder. I want to explain why I waited that long, because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand most often when I've told pieces of it before. I did not wait because I was afraid of her. I waited because I understood, somewhere in the 8 months between the courthouse hallway and that Sunday kitchen table, that I needed the conversation to happen from a position of having already built something, rather than from the position of a 17-year-old still waiting to find out whether her future was going to be handed to her or taken away. I needed to walk into that kitchen already standing on solid ground, so that whatever she said in response couldn't shift the foundation under me the way her silence had shifted it once before. The confrontation, when it finally happened, took place not at a dramatic family gathering, but in the plainest possible setting. My parents' kitchen table, the same table where the party had been canceled 6 years earlier. On an ordinary Sunday afternoon, I'd specifically driven 3 hours to be present for. I brought the folder. I set it on the table between us, unopened, and I asked my mother one question. "Do you know what this is?" She didn't, not specifically, not until I opened it and turned the email chain toward her. I watched her face while she read it, and I want to describe that expression precisely, because I've thought about it more than almost any other moment in my life. It was not shock. Shock would have meant she'd forgotten what she'd done, and I don't believe, even now, that she had. It was something closer to being caught mid-sentence in a lie she'd been telling for so long she'd started to believe her own edited version of it. "I was trying to protect you," she finally said, which is the sentence I have turned over in my mind more times than any other sentence anyone has ever said to me. "Your brother needed us that weekend. I genuinely thought, there'd be another chance for you. I didn't know it would be the only one. You didn't know? I repeated. Or you didn't ask, because asking might have meant choosing me over him, and you'd already decided which way that was going before Des even got home. She didn't have an answer for that. My father, sitting beside her, had gone very quiet, and I later learned, much later, that this was the first time my father had ever actually seen the withdrawal email. That he genuinely had believed, for 6 years, that the fellowship simply hadn't worked out through ordinary misfortune. The same story I had believed until Eleanor's folder surfaced. I left that afternoon with one loose thread I didn't yet know I was pulling. As I stood up from the table, my mother said one more sentence, almost under her breath, more to my father than to me. You have no idea what that whole month cost me, managing what really happened with Desmond. She stopped herself the second the words left her mouth, the way you stop yourself mid-step on a stair you didn't realize was missing. I asked her what she meant by what really happened. She said it was nothing, that she'd misspoken, that the stress of the conversation was making her say things wrong. I let it go that day because I didn't yet have any reason to think there was more beneath a story I'd already spent 6 years believing completely. I drove the 3 hours home with that one sentence sitting strangely in my chest, unable to name why it bothered me as much as it did. I left that afternoon without resolution, without an apology that felt like it matched the size of what had actually happened, and without, frankly, much hope that anything between us would meaningfully change. What actually happened over the following 2 years surprised me, and it built slowly, in pieces I didn't recognize as pieces of the same puzzle, until they were all finally laid out in front of me at once, in the last place I expected. The pieces came slowly, over the following 18 months, never quite locking into a shape until the night they finally did. At Thanksgiving, I overheard my mother on the phone in the hallway, managing, in that hushed tone she used for anything she considered a liability, "We just need to make sure the toast doesn't wander anywhere near the whole baseball thing. Desmond gets funny about it." At a cousin's baby shower that spring, my Aunt Corinne asked me, out of nowhere, whether I'd ever gotten the real story about Dez's baseball thing or just the version your mother tells, and wouldn't say more than that. And that winter, on an ordinary phone call, my father admitted, almost as an aside, "I still don't fully know what happened with Des and that team back then." The reception was held in a converted barn an hour outside the city. 40 or so guests, string lights, the kind of unpretentious, genuinely happy gathering that felt entirely unlike anything our family had produced in my memory. I sat at a table near the back with Eleanor's old friend June, who'd come as my +1 since Eleanor no longer could, and watched my mother move through the room in her element, gracious, glowing, telling anyone who'd listen how proud she was of my boy after everything he's overcome. The toasts began after dinner. My mother's was first, warm, polished, entirely rehearsed, built around the theme of resilience, of a young man who'd faced one of the hardest setbacks of his life and come out the other side stronger. She did not name the setback specifically. She never did, in 13 years, and I watched her deliver that same careful omission one more time, live, in front of 40 witnesses, and felt something in me go very still. The way you go still right before you understand you're about to see something you can't unsee. Then Desmond stood up to give his own toast, and everything I'd been circling for 18 months finally, all at once, landed. He started conventionally enough, thanking Cass's parents, making a joke about how she'd fixed more than his shoulder during his recovery. But partway through, his voice changed, slowed, and he set down the note card he'd clearly prepared. He reached into his jacket instead and pulled out a small brass compass, the one I'd mailed him the week before, holding it up between two fingers so the room could see it, though most of them had no idea yet what they were looking at. "A lot of you know I got cut from my college team, senior year," he said. "What most of you don't know, what I let people believe for a really long time, is that I wasn't cut for bad luck or a coach who didn't see my potential. I got suspended. There was an incident at a party. I started a fight I had no business starting, and the school gave my coach the choice to bench me or cut me. And he cut me. And he was right to." The room had gone completely still. My mother, 3 tables away, had gone the specific shade of pale I would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the color of a person watching their own foundation crack in real time. "I let my family build a whole story around that weekend," Desmond continued, his eyes finding mine across the barn, deliberately. "A story about how unfair it all was, how I needed protecting, how the family had to drop everything for me. And I let that story cost my sister something I only found out about years later. A scholarship interview that got quietly canceled the same weekend because our mother decided my mess needed covering up more than Ren's future needed showing up for. I've never said that out loud, in front of everyone, because I was ashamed of the fight. And then I was ashamed of staying quiet about it for over a decade, and I didn't know which shame to fix first." He looked down at the compass in his hand, turned it once so the needle swung and settled. "Ren gave me one of these when we were kids, and told me our grandmother's whole thing about it, that it doesn't care who's watching, it just points at what's true. I've been carrying a version of my life that pointed wherever was easiest for 13 years. Tonight, I wanted to start married life pointed at something real instead. Ren's here tonight, and Cass's family is here, and I'd rather everyone know the true version of who I am than keep letting a version I didn't earn stand in for me." I want to describe what happened in that barn over the next 10 seconds, because I've replayed them more times than almost any other moment in my adult life. My mother's wine glass, which she'd been holding through the entire toast, tipped out of her hand, not dramatically thrown, just simply physically released, as though her grip had stopped receiving instructions from the rest of her, and shattered on the polished concrete floor, the sound sharp enough that half the room flinched. Nobody moved to help her clean it up, not immediately, because nobody in that barn, including my father, seemed able to look away from her face long enough to remember there was glass on the floor at all. Corinne, from the next table over, said, quietly but audibly in the new silence, "Well, there it is, finally," in a tone that told me she'd been waiting years for exactly this sentence to be spoken by exactly this person. My father sat with his hand over his mouth, and I watched him understand, in real time, in front of 40 witnesses, the same thing I'd understood alone at a kitchen table 2 years earlier. That the story he'd been told about that autumn had never been the whole story, and that his wife had known it the entire time. My mother did not deny it. That's the detail I want to be precise about, because I've thought hard about whether to include it. And I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. She did not stand up and argue, did not claim Desmond was exaggerating, did not offer any version of, "That's not exactly how it happened." She simply sat very still, glass at her feet and said nothing at all, in front of everyone, which was, in its own way, the most complete confirmation she could have given. Desmond finished his toast a few minutes later, shorter than he'd planned, raising his glass to Cass and to starting a marriage with fewer secrets than the family I grew up in. The reception resumed, eventually, the way receptions do. String lights and cake, and a band that mercifully knew to play something upbeat. But something had genuinely, permanently shifted in that room, in a way no private kitchen table conversation ever could have managed. I left that afternoon without resolution in the traditional sense. My mother didn't chase me down the gravel path with an apology, didn't call the next day, didn't do anything for months except go quiet, in a way that felt different from her usual deflection. Quieter. More like someone genuinely unsure, for the first time in my memory, of what story to tell next. What actually happened over the following years surprised me, and it started with my father, standing at the barn's gravel entrance an hour after the toast, waiting for me by my car.
"I should have asked more questions back then,"
he said, turning his keys over in his hand.
"I've been telling myself for 13 years that I just didn't know. Watching Des say that tonight, I think I have to admit I didn't know because I never asked. And there's a difference. And I let that difference protect me for a long time."
I told him I knew. Not that it was okay, because I was done saying that particular lie to make other people comfortable. Just that I knew. My father sends me a card every year around my birthday now, always with the same handwritten line at the bottom.
"Wish I'd asked more questions back then."
Which isn't an apology exactly, but it's the closest thing to honesty he's managed to offer in 13 years. And I've learned to let that be enough, because waiting for more from him has never once produced more. Desmond and I talk regularly now, in a way we never did as kids, something closer to an actual friendship than the strange, uneven distance our childhood had assigned us. He told me, months after the wedding, that he'd been building toward that toast for almost 2 years, ever since the afternoon he found out, secondhand through Corinne, that I'd finally confronted our mother with Eleanor's folder.
"I kept almost telling you myself," he admitted. "Every time I got close, I thought about doing it quietly, in private, the way you did. But I realized the lie hadn't happened quietly. Mom built it in front of the whole family at full volume, over and over for 13 years. I figured the truth deserved the same room."
My mother, for her part, sent one letter 4 months after the wedding, shorter than I expected. 2 paragraphs, mostly about the shock of that evening, and 1 line near the end that did all the actual work.
"I don't know how to undo 13 years in a letter, and I'm not going to pretend I do. I'm sorry it took Desmond's courage instead of mine."
It wasn't everything. It wasn't close to everything. But it was the first sentence she had ever produced in my entire life that didn't quietly manage the truth into something more comfortable to hold. I want to go back, briefly, to those 4 undergraduate years, because I skipped over them quickly earlier, and I think the texture of them matters. My freshman year, I lived in the cheapest dorm option the university offered, a converted 1960s building with cinder block walls that Eleanor, visiting once that fall, described diplomatically as efficient. I worked at a campus coffee cart 3 mornings a week before my earliest lecture, and Saturdays, all day, at a garden supply store on the edge of town, not because I had any particular passion for garden supplies, but because the manager didn't ask questions about my availability and paid weekly instead of bi-weekly, which mattered enormously to someone counting every dollar against every bill. I did not go home for winter break that first year. I told my parents I'd picked up extra shifts, which was true, though it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I genuinely didn't know, at 18, freshly out of that house, how to sit across a dinner table from my mother without the entire withdrawn fellowship situation sitting silently between us, even though I wouldn't actually discover the real story behind it for another 3 years. I spent that Christmas with Eleanor instead. Just the 2 of us. a small tree in her front window, and a ham she overcooked slightly every single year with total confidence that it was perfect. And I remember thinking that December that I had accidentally built a better holiday out of less than my parents ever managed to build out of more. Sophomore year, Dr. Anand's fellowship connection came through, the partial research position I mentioned, and it changed the math of everything. Not comfortable, not close to comfortable, but survivable in a way freshman year hadn't quite been. I spent that year and the two after it in a research lab studying corrosion-resistant alloys, work that felt, to my genuine surprise, almost meditative. The same slow, exacting satisfaction I remembered from Dr. Anand's high school lab. Except now the questions were harder, and nobody was checking in 90 seconds later to see if the conversation should really be about someone else. Eleanor died the winter of my senior year, quickly, of a stroke, with almost no warning. And I want to be honest that this is the part of the story I still find hardest to talk about, even now, even having told the rest of it fairly openly. She had driven me 2 hours each way to an interview that turned out to mean nothing, sat in a parking lot with a crossword rather than leave me alone in an unfamiliar city, given me a birthday cake from a grocery store bakery with a card that said, "No conditions attached," and I did not get to properly thank her for any of it before she was gone. Because you rarely get to properly thank the people who simply show up for you the way you need, since showing up rarely announces itself as something requiring gratitude until it's no longer there to receive it. The estate process that followed, the one that eventually led me to that manila folder in a courthouse hallway, was handled by a lawyer Eleanor had used for decades, an unhurried man who walked me through each box of her belongings personally, because she'd apparently left a note asking that I be the one to go through her papers myself, rather than have them boxed up and shipped. I think, now, that this was deliberate too. One more piece of the same quiet architecture. She wanted me to be the one holding that folder when I found it. Not a stranger, not even my own parents, but me, alone, with the time and space to understand what I was looking at before anyone else got the chance to explain it away. I still work in materials science, 6 years into a career built on exactly the kind of rigorous, methodical thinking Dr. Anand first noticed in a bored teenager washing glassware after school. I lead a small research team now, 4 people, at a lab studying next-generation battery materials. And 18 months ago, we brought on a summer intern named Priya. No relation to Dr. Anand, just a coincidence of names that made me smile the first time I read her application. A 19-year-old sophomore from a state school 2 hours from campus, sharp, quiet, and visibly unused to having her ideas taken seriously by anyone in a position of authority. I noticed the pattern almost immediately, the way you notice a language you used to speak fluently, even after years of not using it. Priya apologized before every question, prefaced every observation with, "This might be a dumb idea, but," and flinched almost imperceptibly the first time I asked her to present her own findings to the rest of the team, rather than fold them quietly into someone else's report. I started, without really deciding to, doing for her some version of what Dr. Anand once did for me, correcting her work exactingly, without cushioning it in false praise, but also making sure, every single time, that her name went on her own findings before anyone else's did. 3 months into her internship, she came into my office and told me, hesitantly, that her older brother had just gotten into serious trouble back home. Nothing dramatic by outside standards. A car accident that was mostly his fault, some resulting family chaos, and that her parents were asking her to come home early to help manage things, effectively ending her internship 6 weeks ahead of schedule. I watched her deliver this news with the exact posture I remembered from my own 17-year-old self, already halfway to apologizing for an inconvenience that wasn't hers to apologize for. I did not tell her what to do. That wasn't my place, and I've learned enough by now to know that rescuing someone from a decision they need to make themselves rarely actually helps them. But I did ask her one question. The same question I wished someone had asked me at 17. Is this actually the only weekend this internship's final presentation can happen? Or is that just the story that's easiest for everyone else if you leave?
She sat with that question for a long moment. And then she called her parents back and asked, directly, whether there was any flexibility at all. And there was, it turned out, because nobody had actually checked before assuming there wasn't. She finished her internship, her final presentation on thermal stability in solid-state battery components was, without exaggeration, the best work anyone on my team produced that summer, including several people twice her age. I keep Eleanor's original compass on my desk now, not in a drawer anymore, next to a small framed photograph of her, sitting in that parking lot with her crossword, the one I found among her things the same week I found the folder. Some mornings, before I open my email, I pick it up out of habit, more than necessity, and watch the needle find true north, the same way it always has, indifferent to whatever else is happening in the room. It has never once pointed anywhere convenient. I've come to think that's the entire point of it. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take away, it's this. The people who quietly rewrite your history rarely do it out of malice in the moment. They do it because managing the story feels easier in that instant than sitting with the harder, more honest version of what actually happened. But easier for them almost always means more expensive for you. Paid later, in years you don't get back, in opportunities you never fully understand you lost. Keep your own records. Ask the second question, and the third, especially when the first answer arrives a little too smoothly. And if you ever find your own folder, in whatever form it takes, know that opening it doesn't obligate you to burn anything down. Sometimes it just finally lets you understand which parts of your life were actually your fault, and which parts, all along, never were. Find the thing in your own life that works like a compass. The person, the object, the plain fact that doesn't care who's in the room. And when everyone around you is pointing in whatever direction is most convenient for them, let that be the thing you trust instead. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Calm Drama Stories and tell me in the comments about a moment in your life you later found out wasn't what you were told it was. I read every one. Next week, another story, told calmly, all the way to the end.